Well, good morning, good afternoon, friends, as you're joining us here. We're going to give about a minute as everyone's joining before we formally begin. If you want to type in the chat box who you are, where you're from, your role and capacity that you're joining us, we'd love to see where people are joining from across the country, across theological traditions. My name is Joel Thiessen. I am director of the Flourishing Congregations Institute. We're delighted to have you joining us today. Morning or afternoon, depending where you are across the country. We'll give another 30 seconds or so as people are joining, and then we will formally begin our time together. Again, in the chat box at the top, invite you to enter your name, your location, and your role, and very much looking forward to our time together today. All right, we have many from across the country and across theological traditions who are joining us, so we're excited to be all together here today. Well, I think we will formally begin. I know a few others will join us along the way, but want to formally welcome you to this special 1-hour webinar based on our recently released book, The Stories Congregations Tell: Flourishing in the Face of Transition and Change. In this webinar today, you're going to hear from two of our three co-editors from the project, including myself, Joel Thiessen, professor of sociology and director of the Flourishing Congregations Institute, along with my colleague here at the Institute, Dr. Arch Wong, Associate Director at the Institute and one of the co-editors as part of this project. After the two of us give a bit of an overview on this project, we're going to hear from three practitioners who have also co-authored one of the chapters in the book that you'll hear about today. And so we will hear from Archbishop Linda Nicholls, retired primate. We'll hear from Reverend Dr. Sarah Hahn, and then we'll hear from Father James Mallon after we give a bit of an overview on this project. So each will introduce themselves later on as we get further into the webinar. Just a few logistics as we get going here. We are recording this webinar and we're going to make this available to you afterwards. So you can receive the recording by subscribing on our website, and that will come out later this week. Also, following the presentations today, we're going to open things up for questions. And so if any questions come to mind, either from the overview of the book or as you hear our practitioners today, I would invite you to insert your questions into the Q&A box at the top of your screen, and then I'll moderate some of the conversation afterwards based on your questions. So without further ado, we will jump right in. So as you can see on the screen, before you see the three co-editors, myself and Arch Wong, and then Mark Chapman at Tyndale University in Toronto, unfortunately unable to join us today. But the three of us are responsible for co-editing this project, and we have many collaborators across the country who have contributed chapters. If you're interested in picking up a copy of this book afterwards, after you learn a bit more about this, would invite you to scan the QR code, and that will take you to a link where you can pick that up. It's also featured on our website, and we'll share some information following this webinar as well. So what is this book about? This study addresses two central research questions. The first, what are the mechanisms, pathways, and processes that contribute to congregational flourishing? And second, how does congregational flourishing intersect with individuals, neighborhoods, and organizations? Our primary audience in writing this book is church and denominational leaders, reflected, for example, in many questions that we provide throughout each of the chapters. And then at the end of every chapter, we provide some questions that are intended to help guide church and denominational leaders to think upon and reflect the material in that chapter in their own local context. The work throughout this project builds on some of our prior research at the Flourishing Congregations Institute, notably 11 different dimensions of a flourishing congregation. And you can see these on the screen before you. We also have these on our website, and you can kind of interact with those in greater detail. This particular book features 7 Canadian-based case studies from Catholic, mainline, and conservative Protestant congregations across the country. So Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, London, Montreal, and Halifax regions. And these 7 case studies are part of a larger set of case studies and project that we've been working on across the country that features 12 case studies, over a dozen different scholars in different regions of the country. Now, each of these case studies involved data collection over a 6 to 12-month period between 2021 and 2023. And each of the case studies included the following methods. Interviews with paid and lay leaders, participant observation activities, surveys with congregants. We included an appreciative inquiry event with leaders and congregants that included a timeline exercise, community demographics analysis, and content analysis of various sources that included things like church websites, archival records, web and social media resources, and bulletins. In a moment, Arch is going to share one of the congregation's stories. But before we do so, I want to situate this book against the backdrop of two central concepts that we rely on throughout the project. The first is the idea of a storytelling organization. As our team gathered throughout this project, we noted a recurring theme of flourishing congregations who had confronted many transitions and changes, and whose stories and ways of telling their stories warranted careful analysis. For us, we discovered that flourishing was not a permanent or static state, and no doubt you know this in your own local context or ministry. What we wanted to do as researchers was to better understand the role of storytelling in the ebb and flow of congregational flourishing. In his 1995 article, Stories of the Storytelling Organization, David Boge describes the storytelling organization as a, quote, collective storytelling system in which the performance of stories is a key part of member sense-making and a means to allow them to supplement individual memories with institutional memory, end quote. James Hopewell says this in his 1984 book, Congregation, Stories, and Structures. Quote, narrative underlies each congregation's view of the world, its assumptions about the setting or backdrop against which its actions are sequenced, and its unique ethos thrown into visible relief, end quote. We use this framework of storytelling organizations to situate our presentation and analysis of the 7 case studies in this book with attentiveness to what stories are told, how they are told, and who is telling them. Alongside the concept of the storytelling organization, we draw upon cultural sociology to help frame and interpret the stories that congregations tell, paying attention to both the culture of a congregation along with the web of cultures that congregations operated in that impact the congregation. For example, congregations are part of denominations, and so that has its own subculture, or Canadian society, and so forth. And so we look at the interaction between these things. In our linkage between stories and culture, we build on Nancy Ammerman, who states, quote, a culture includes the congregation's history and stories of its heroes. It includes its symbols, rituals, and worldview. It is shaped by the cultures in which its members live, represented by their demographic characteristics, but it takes on its own unique identity and character when those members come together, end quote. One of our underlying assumptions throughout the book is that congregational culture grounds a congregation's identity, linking the past, present, and future. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Arch, who's going to share one of those stories from our case study. So over to you, Arch.
Yes, thanks, Joel. And in the remainder of Joel and my time, we just wanted to share one congregation story from chapter 3, basically teasing out several of the themes to stand out across our various case studies. So St. Eustace Church, it's not its real name, was birthed in the mid 20th century in British Columbia. Decades later, it merged with another small church and hired a new minister with that person had a very strong vision for community outreach. And shortly after this merger, vandals set fire to St. Eustace's building. And this congregation, they continued to meet in a school gym for years before they had the funds to construct a new building. And once the new facility was ready, the pastor retired and a new leader entered with a renewed vision for, I would say, even stronger community outreach. And so today, St. Eustace's is a medium-sized church whose building is teeming with lots and lots of activity each week. They host programs for church members. They have meals for those in the neighborhood, and they offer space for Alcoholics Anonymous and English as a second language groups. So over the 70 years after it was formed, St. Eustace's is now known for its strength in community engagement. It's known for its spiritual development, its authenticity, and I would say inclusiveness. And so St. Eustace's is a flourishing congregation where people's spiritual, their physical, and I would say relational needs are attended to. Now, part of what sets St. Eustace's apart is what is called this repertoire of resilience. Let me say that again, repertoire of resilience. And basically, these are the aspirational stories and symbols its leaders and members develop, and they use it to frame, say, difficult periods in their past to shape their future possibilities. And so one example is the group's members' reflection on the merger and the fire and their leader transition. So rather than pulling this community, I would say, apart, they these I would say trying experiences drew members closer together. So in fact, the period without a building was embraced as an opportunity rather than a tragedy for this church to reimagine its future. So a stark reminder of St. Eustace's resilience is, as you can see, the charred cross from the burned building that is central in their weekly worship gatherings. I think you can see that on the right side of the screen there. And this symbol says much to this congregation about its past, its present, and future. And part of their narrative is they're open to change. And this is, I would say, the core to their DNA as they embark on the yet not to be written story in years to come. And so the particulars of St. Eustace's experiences may be unique to them, but I would say that there are many others like them across Canada who flourished in the face of this transition and this change. And so a recurring question we take up in the book is, what stories do congregations tell when confronted with transition and change? And what can other churches learn, I would say, in the process towards their own flourishing? And so central themes to emerge from these case studies include a number of things. Visionary leadership that is collaborative and inspires the lay to make decisions. Innovation and this entrepreneurial initiatives. Clear congregational identity rooted in spiritual formation. Intentional systems and structures oriented towards a congregation's mission and vision. A hospitable community, hospitality community among members, and engaging laity who collectively own and participate in the congregation's mission. And so part of telling, I would say, our story and telling that story well as a congregation involves leaders and members possessing a clear and shared sense of what sets us apart. So I would say our distinct histories, our identities, our cultures, symbols, values, and so forth, in ways that link the past, present, and the imagined future. So it's also important to note that these narratives, particularly in the book, are embedded and shaped by a web of other stories and subcultures and relationships. So, for example, a church's denomination or geographic location and demographic composition all interact in, I would say, very nuanced ways to inform what makes our congregation, us. And so, also significant, I would say, is this is who controls and tells the story, right? And what storylines and details are included, or what stories are excluded. And the stories churches tell shape how they exist and function as a living organism. And so we say on the final page of the book, stories help, quote, the congregation identify what is going on, why it's going on, what should be going on, and how to respond to it. Now, of course, not all shared stories are, helpful for flourishing. Some stories are problematic and dysfunctional. And how does a church know if the self narrative it tells is, say, helpful towards, say, a vibrant and life giving ministry with and for others? And I think part of the answer may be found in assessing the presence or absence of themes, the things that we mentioned above in one's church. So, are we hospitable? Do we take risk? Is our ministry grounded in spiritual formation? Do laity meaningfully participate in and own the church's vision and mission and ministry? And so for St. Eustace, they tell, and I would say they embody the story of who they are and are becoming a religious community in many ways through their artifacts, through their symbols, their physical space, their historical documents and narratives, rituals, and language. Just let me to conclude. Let me conclude. Um, Congregations will know they've told their story well when those new and old to their community can similarly describe, the central plot, the actors, and so forth that make our church, ours. And so, whatever story a congregation tells, the emerging story is yet to be written and lived. And so, flourishing congregations don't just tell stories, they draw on those stories of their past and present to move into the future with, I would want to say and hope this open posture towards what is yet to come. All right, I'll stop there, but I just want to give a few acknowledgments. And so, with that overview, we just want to acknowledge the congregations who participated, the many research assistants across the country who assisted with the data collection and analysis, along with the many contributors who you see in the table of contents. And finally, we want to acknowledge the research funding from for this project from the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. I'll pass the time to you, Joel. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Arch. We're excited to have three practitioners with us to provide a response who have also co-authored, I believe it's chapter 9 in the text. And so I'm going to begin by handing it over to Archbishop Linda Nicholls, retired primate, who's going to begin by offering some remarks. And then I will pass it off to each of our other respondents after that. So Archbishop Nicholls, over to you.
There. Sorry about that.
All good, all good.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here this afternoon. There's an echo. Are you hearing it?
We are not.
You're not. Okay. I will try to ignore it. Okay. Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. I have been an Anglican priest since 1986, so almost 40 years of working in congregations, directly, and then about 17 years as a bishop, and then more laterally as the primate of the Anglican Church of Canada. So also in a supervisory role, or at least a working with other clergy and leaders for congregational health. What I particularly loved about this book is it starts from the recognition of the uniqueness of every congregation. That there's been a concern for healthy, flourishing parishes for a long time. And for a while, it was, at least in my early years of ministry, it was almost as if you could go out and search for a program. And if you could just find the right program to apply to the parish, it would be healthy. And we quickly learned that that just didn't work. It worked in some places, but not in all. And I think this book acknowledges that what is at the heart is the uniqueness of each congregation. As Arch was just saying, the stories of that congregation, its DNA, it's what has formed it and shaped it denominationally, what has formed and shaped it in its own context, what has formed and shaped its people, sometimes for good or ill. And so what I liked was that this was starting from what you have on the ground, by getting people to tell their stories, and to be able to come alongside that and to listen to how that story then intersects with the story we are all trying to live, which is the story of salvation in Jesus Christ, and the story of the Christian hope rooted in the full salvation narrative of the scriptures. I think the way in which each of the congregations took time to investigate and to listen to all of the people, both in the context around them, but also internally, was really critical to the life of their community. And paying attention to the context, which of course is always changing. There are people moving in and moving out. I remember when I went to my last parish, people's memories were primarily of a golden era that was gone. And they hadn't actually looked to see who was there now in the community around them, and the importance of paying attention to who was moving in. Where did they come from? What were their needs? What were their aspirations? What were their longings? And so the book highlights the need for people to do that, and also to look internally to see where the gifts are in the community. If you have lots of people who come from a particular sector of society, whether that's professional or in other ways, they bring gifts with them that need to be acknowledged and drawn on. Also, the emphasis on collaborative leadership in the congregations. Over and over, it wasn't just the pastor, the priest, the leaders, the official leaders. It was drawing in teams of people so that the stories that they were sharing and telling were shared across the whole community. So there were several things that I thought were important. The thread of the stories of the congregation, both the descriptive story of its history and life, and the prescriptive, the vision of what they aim to be. Secondly, that they were looking at all of the factors in their communities and around them. They were adaptive and flexible, because when things went wrong or didn't work, they were able to change. They were engaged in collaborative leadership. They had leadership that had a vision, and they paid attention to their context. Just to highlight briefly one piece of this that I think is important. As I began, I said, you know, we all want a program that's going to fit for everybody. And of course, there isn't one. So what we need to do is come alongside other congregations, not to copy what they're doing, but to listen to them. And in the book, I used the example, because I've been involved in Anglican Roman Catholic dialogue for 40 years, and used the example of the current method of that dialogue, which is receptive ecumenism, which is to come alongside one another and to listen closely to the story of the other, and to learn from each other, to learn what is good and gifted in the other, and to see that in yourself, or to see where you have gaps and where you might try something different. So just wanted to highlight that methodology as being one that I think was exemplified in this book. So thank you.
It's great. Thanks, Archbishop Linda. I really appreciate both the spirit with which you interact with this material and obviously a career-long interaction with parishes to see how this works on the ground. So looking forward to some more conversation later on with all of us together. Next, I'm going to invite Reverend Dr. Sarah Hahn, who's going to share some of her reflections and interaction with the material. So Sarah, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah, and I'm an ordained Presbyterian minister, and I've served in church ministry, both in bigger kind of multi-site church contexts, but also in house church plant networks here in Canada for the past 2 decades. And so I've seen a lot of different kind of communities express the gospel of Christ. And I also teach at Tyndale Seminary. I'm also married to a pastor, and I'm a child of 2 pastors. Got a lot of pastors in the family. And I have 3 young kids who have always just been at the forefront of my hope and vision for the Church of Canada in the future. And I'm just so grateful for this book. Firstly, because it's Canadian. We don't have enough Canadian books on the church out there. And I just love to hear stories of congregations that are just here from our nation. And I just love that it focuses on the power of telling stories and how stories can be told to help us flourish through transition and flourish through change. And what we can observe through the stories in this book is that it's not the building or the programs or even, the brand name of a church that is the church, but it's really the people. People are the church. And when we look at the stories told by the congregations in this book, it really reminds us that flourishing happens when we engage in intentional, honest relationships with each other and with God. And the part I found really encouraging was that the book highlighted that it's not just when things are perfect, because let's be honest, life is never perfect, but that flourishing really happens even in very messy situations, that when there's hardship that comes up, when there are transitions and pain and uncertainty, that so many of the people in these congregations that we read about, they didn't just survive the difficult seasons, they really thrived as they leaned into God together. And we can see in their stories just how healing and resilience came as they became the presence of God to one another. And so I just found that very profound, that it wasn't about seeking perfection to find that flourishing, but it was just simply being present to one another. And I just see this thread, this beautiful thread of resilience and resonance expressed through relationship through all the stories in this book. And there were just so many examples of how people just chose to show up, they chose to live life together and focus on Christ together. And that is really what allowed them to flourish. And I just, I love telling stories, and I'm so glad that this book is focused on stories. They just give meat to what we're trying to say, don't they? And stories are so wonderful because our God is a storytelling God. And for those of you that are in ministry here, don't let anyone tell you you're in a dying field just because there are churches that are closing. Stories will live on just as people live on. And as long as you cling to the story of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the harvest is plentiful and there will always be work for you. But God reveals himself, in the stories we tell one each other. We see them in the book, the messy parts, the joyful parts, the ordinary parts. And when we uncover God's story within one another, we really get to become like Christ to one another, don't we? And I think that's the real challenge that we face in this generation that is, so immersed in the digital age, is that we have these daily rhythms that in many times are so busy and keep us from going into deeper community. Life is just so fast. The phone is always in our hands. It's so hard to get past that shallow connection, that so many of us consume when we're doom scrolling, and to really cultivate deep relationship instead. This past summer, I was in Korea, and I noticed that at crosswalks, they don't have the walk and the stop sign, up on the traffic lights, but they have them on the floor now. It's because so many people are looking down at their phones when they're walking that they're not looking up to see that it's not time to walk. And so there have actually been accidents of people being hit by cars. And so they put the lines on the floor. And that's kind of, symbolic of how we live our lives. So many of us have our heads down, and whether it's external busyness or just even internal fear of being judged, fear of being vulnerable, fear of conflict or exhaustion. So many of us, we don't exemplify, this kind of flourishing relationship that we see in so many of the individuals in the congregations that we read about in this book. And we see in this books just stories of people who are able to overcome barriers by flourishing in relationship, by making intentional effort, having humility and vulnerability, and really trusting in God's mission and living out that mission through relationship. And so, they practice creative leadership, but most of all, I was just so encouraged that these congregations, they really fought for connection. They, in so many of the stories, they really practiced that persistent obedience, and they just showed up even when it was difficult, and they were vulnerable, and then they were honest. And really, in the messiness of their honesty, we see that God was able to allow them to flourish. And, it just made me think that so often in church, we tend to hide, and we tend to think that keeping things to ourselves that are hard is the way to flourish as leaders. I know when I was serving at a big church, and when our congregation members would come up to me, and my husband and I were pastoring together at that time, and they would say, "We just can't imagine the two of you fighting." The message underneath that was, they better not know that we're fighting. And yet, as we have been more intentional in our ministry context in this season, just to be transparent about who we are. And even if we have an argument on Sunday morning, that so many times, that's what happens, that in our prayer circle before service, we'll say, "Can you pray for us? We're having a hard time. We need the covering of Jesus Christ." And it's in those moments of real intentional effort with humility, vulnerability, that I've personally experienced God at work. And so, I just love the reminders that this book has given us, to just carve out space to hear the stories of others and to really tell our own stories as well. My kids love to ask me all the time, "Tell us a story, Mom, tell us a story." And I have to be honest, so many times at the end of the day, I'm just too tired to tell them a story about my life or a story about who Jesus is. And yet I feel deeply convicted, reading the stories in this book, that it's when we make time to listen to stories and tell our stories that we really see God come alive in between us in the relationships that we share. And so as I close off, I hope we can just challenge ourselves and ask ourselves, as we read the stories in this book, really applying it into our own leadership and our own faith journey. How can I make space for God, the stories that He is wanting to share through me, and the stories that I can hear all around me? Because when we share those stories, we don't just build flourishing communities, but we really become it. Thank you.
It's great. Thank you so much, Sarah. Really value your emphasis on being attentive to God, self, and others as part of a larger story, of God's story that helps congregations to not just survive. I really appreciated that you drew this distinction that thriving is different than surviving, and how does an attentiveness nurture that? So thank you for that. All right, I'm delighted now to hand it over to Father James Mallon on the East Coast. So Father Mallon, over to you.
Well, first of all, hi everyone across the country, and thanks so much for taking time out of your busy conversations. Stories that have been described always lead to conversations. And I once heard someone say that the beginning of change in the church is changing the conversation. Conversation shapes the culture. And I think at the heart of flourishing is a healthy culture, as was demonstrated within the book. I want to thank Joel and his team for this incredible work, because I think we must, as brothers and sisters in Christ, in spite of the variety of backgrounds that we come from, we must have these conversations together, because we all have particular strengths, we all have particular perspectives, and we can definitely mutually enrich one another. So I see this book as certainly being a major contribution to that. I'm fundamentally a pastor. I'm a parish priest. I've been a parish priest for 27 years now. I used to be young. I used to have a black beard. So I've been mostly pastoring. I've pastored small rural parishes, inner city parish, an inner city parish, a large suburban parish, and now I'm in I went into recently a newly amalgamated merger of 5 dying communities during COVID, which is the most challenging thing I've ever experienced in my life. But what I'm convinced of is that there are a set of principles that will yield fruitfulness. And these principles, how we live them out, they might look differently from one context to another, but my own, conviction / reflection and experience in learning from others has reinforced my conviction that these principles and all of these principles were identified and named within the book, which is really exciting. One of the other things I do is I work with a ministry called Divine Renovation, and we work with parishes around the world to help them experience what we call transformation from what we call maintenance to mission, to being so rather than being inward focused churches, like having like the dynamic of a club, to be actually being outward focused, and that conversion to mission is primarily one of identity. Mission is not what we do or what we may do. It is fundamentally who we are, and then that identity conversion has to be, because I'm not convinced all the churches has that identity. That conversion must become a posture, and that's a very real shift from with our timetables, our use of buildings, our use of resources, our use of money, the activities we do, to actually see a church begin to turn outward and look outside of itself, rather than being focused on the needs of its members. And then finally, it's the challenge is to normalize that posture and identity into a culture. And this kind of transformation takes time. In our experience in reflecting on the book, it seems to me that there are some of these principles that you've identified are, I would say, perhaps at a more derived principles from core fundamental ones. I'd just like to quickly share with you three that I'm convinced of myself, and the first one is identified in the book, and that's leadership, because no matter how you identify flourishing, the things that bear fruit, fruit just doesn't happen within the church. If you do nothing, fruit doesn't occur. The things that make the difference, the things that make the human soil of a parish healthy, so that it can bear forth fruit, they happen only when we're intentional about certain things. And intentionality always involves leadership. So, as was identified, the importance of clarity of a compelling vision, of mission, and of a communal shared experience of leadership. I think that's very important in the church today, that we move away from the kind of the Lone Ranger model of the pastor leader who somehow has all the answers, because that's I think it always was a myth, and it certainly is a myth today, as we find ourselves in very much uncharted territory. So the importance of leadership, and at least in my tradition and many mainline traditions, this is not something that was part of our formation. And so it's something that we have to learn and discover. The second principle that I think is more foundational is also identified in the book, and that is evangelism, or as we'd say in my Catholic context, evangelization. And, I think that although we may have different spiritualities in different churches and different ways to understand this theologically, the point is that, as I've often said to my parishioners here in my new parish, doesn't matter how strong the arms are, how strong the legs are, how strong the hands and feet are of the body of Christ, if the heart is ready to fail. And the heart of the church is the making of disciples, and the forming of disciples and equipping. And we've certainly, they've been identified within the book. But in my experience of church life, that central thing that is at the heart, which leads to life being expressed. I mean, in order for the church to worship, there's got to be disciples. In order for the church to serve the poor, there's got to be disciples to evangelize, et cetera, et cetera. We've got to be, in a sense, bringing people to Jesus and helping them to encounter him and form a relationship with him and commit to him. And so in the busyness of church life, that never, again, just happens. It needs to be intentional. And the third thing is I think it's implicit within the book, but in my own experience anyway, is something that reminds us that the church is not just a sociological phenomenon, and that what we battle isn't just a psychological issue. It's fundamentally spiritual, and so the role and presence and the power of the Holy Spirit. I mean, Jesus was quite clear in Luke's gospel, remain in the city until you are clothed with power from on high. And that very strong implication that you ain't doing this by your own strength. And how that works out, it's kind of mysterious. We know that from the experience of the Holy Spirit we've had in our own lives, but there's that power, that divine power, that supernatural power, without which we're not going very far, no matter how wonderful our strategies are and how hard we work. And so that we grapple with that and submit to that and constantly invite the power of God into our midst. So these are, and my own experience interacting with the contents of the book, three really foundational things that I think are very much integrally connected to the rest of what's been identified within the book.
That's great. Thanks, Father James. I appreciate the way in which you end by drawing our attention to the limits of the social sciences, that it doesn't capture everything there is to understand about local congregations, and that there is a clear spiritual dynamic and component. And certainly one of the things we wanted to tap into in the book, of not just drawing on social scientists, but practical theologians and so forth, and reflecting on this, that there's both an intentionality from an organizational perspective, but a deep dependence and reliance on the Spirit, which is good. My thanks to each of you for sharing with us so far. What we're going to do in the remainder of our time is I'm going to moderate a bit of a conversation here with our different panelists, and as you have questions, feel free to add those to the Q&A box, and we'll field some of those. But maybe I'll begin by asking the three of you, if you were to help a congregation or parish to name or identify its story, how does a congregation even begin to do that? To name and identify its story, and then maybe even how to tell its story, and to tell its story well. So it's a fairly wide open question. You each have different experiences and different contexts. So I'm happy for any of you to jump in first, and we'll kind of work our way around the three of you. So which of you would like to begin on that question?
Sure, I can jump in, because I've had many experience of moments where I've either joined a new congregation or had to work with a congregation. And one of the ways is simply to get them on a timeline, to lay out a great big long piece of paper and ask people to write on it when they arrived in the parish and the key highlights. And somebody will put the Great Fire of 1845, and somebody else will put, when this person arrived here, or when this priest or pastor arrived. And gradually you begin to build a picture of the congregation, and it starts the conversations between people, between generations, and between different people in the community. The other thing I remember being very struck by was when a congregation was trying to renew its relationship with its community around it, and needed to begin to connect with the people in the community, and wasn't quite sure how to do that. And there were two deacons in the community, in the parish, and they started going out and just walking the streets around the parish, picking up garbage. And they just walked around and picked up the garbage, and people would stop and say, "Why are you doing that?" And they would say, "Well, we're here, we're in the community." And they started conversations, and they began to find out from people what it was that would make a difference. And that led to the development of a community supper program to bring people together into the building and to get to know one another. So I think there's as many different ways of learning to tell the stories and gather the stories, but those were just a couple that occurred off the top of my head. Yeah.
Excellent, very helpful, thank you. I think one of our favorite moments as researchers was doing a timeline exercise with each of the congregations and parishes. And so right along the whole wall, we had it laid out and had different people going up with sticky notes, etc. And it was an animating experience for people to tell their story, and to maybe even think for the first time about that story and where they are located within those stories. So very, very helpful. Sarah or Father James, your thoughts?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think similarly, an activity we love to do at our church is we just have people make a timeline of even their own personal story as well. And so we'll draw two kind of mounds like this, and then we'll say, why don't you share the two highlights and two lowlights that you see throughout your own life when it comes to your walk of faith. And we share stories a little bit more deeply, trying to be a little bit more vulnerable and create space for that. And we just found that when people get used to sharing their own stories, and it leads to greater communal sharing of stories as a congregation as well. And so to even just create those kind of rhythms and patterns where people can go deeper and to intentionally share more about who we are, other than just what you can see on the surface, has been very powerful. I love the book Pastor as Ethnographer. I'm sure many of you have read that book before, and it just really helps us to see ourselves as pastors and leaders as observers of the deeper things in our congregation and learning how to ask good questions. And so those would be my 2 suggestions.
Excellent. Thanks. Father James.
Well, and in my context, I'm not sure if any of the listeners can identify with this, but we tend to have a very narrow understanding of what the story consists of. And it generally can be brought down to this, the history of our buildings, the clergy, and the past. And the number of parishes I've got into, you get these photo directories. I don't know if you see these, and the front of the photo directory is always a picture of a building, and the inside cover is always a list of the pastors, and then there's a bunch of pictures of people, and that often is what the story has been reduced to. And so one of the first things is to try to convince and convict people that the story is far greater, is far richer, is far more colorful than you think. I mean, let's start by banishing pictures of buildings off of our bulletins and publications as if the church was a building. Let's start showing people. Let's start showing the living stones, and then recognizing that these living stones have stories of their own. And as wonderful as it is to have a history of who the pastors were and the clergy, but let's begin to have our people share their stories, as we heard, of their conversion, of their experience of ministry, call to ministry, and even their experience of stepping into an experience of leadership, what that's like, because these stories just explode our paradigms, and we need them so much. And then finally, liberating the church from being just about the past, like what is God doing now? What is the present narrative? And even, dare we dream? Do we include our dream for the future in our storybook?
Fantastic. The past, present, and future are intertwined, and how do we think about those in very holistic ways is a very helpful reminder here. Sarah, could you just remind us of the name of the book for those who maybe didn't capture that?
Yeah, sure. It's Pastor as Ethnographer, and I could put it into the chat. I'll put the title there, actually.
Fantastic. That's great. We'll throw that in there. Maybe the next question I'd have, and maybe we'll start with Father James this time. When you think about vision and mission, are there core elements that you think need to be included in a parish's or congregation's mission and vision that would contribute to its flourishing?
Yeah, I think, first of all, making a proper distinction between these two things, because so often people will say this is our vision, and what they actually describe is either mission or a set of values or a list of things that they do. And I think if we're going to lead parishes in a particular direction, the fire has got to be maintained, and if we're not clear about that, then it's not going to last. So this idea of vision is really being linked to passion and to hope, and it's. And a leader has to be honest about his or her role in shaping that. Of course, congregational vision is not just delivered from on high like Moses coming down from Mount Sinai. It's going to be handled. It's going to be reshaped to some degree. But the influence of the leader is unmistakable. I mean, I think in all of our traditions, you leave a pastor in a local church long enough, that local church will end up being passionate about the things the pastor's passionate about. It's like people and their dogs, like the people who look like their dogs look like their owners. It happens every single time, because a pastor intentionally or unintentionally is going to pass on the thing that person is passionate about. Here's the thing: you can't fake passion long term. You can fake it in the short term, but not long term. You can't change what you're passionate about. So there's the need to be honest about that. Like, what really excites me, because that's going to be brought to bear and is going to influence a congregation heavily. So I think there needs to be clarity about that, and recognizing the singular role of the pastor in that process, but also being intentional about bringing others around so that it becomes shared as much as possible.
It's great. Thank you. Archbishop Linda, any thoughts?
Joel, could you repeat
Yes,
your
I think
question?
that
Is that okay?
what was linked with that is that there has to be a deep spiritual formation of the congregation. And that's what some of those congregations were identifying, was the need to do that intentionally. And I think I belong to a traditional mainline church that kind of assumed that formation would happen in the liturgy. And we've had to discover that no, it doesn't actually, especially when people are only there infrequently, like they're not there every Sunday in the way they used to be 50 years ago. So that formation has not actually taken place to the degree that we would like it to and that we need it to. So how do we deepen that spiritual formation so that the values that undergird that vision are truly rooted in the gospel? And we're being challenged about that daily in the current events around us. What is the gospel calling us to do and be in the midst of the world today? And then from that, what is this congregation called to in this place, in this moment? And so the two are linked and can't be separated. So there's a constant focusing inward and a focusing outward that has to, it's kind of a dance that goes back and forth. And there may be periods of time where the congregation needs to focus inward because it doesn't have enough spiritual depth to really hold together the vision and the mission. And at other times, it's got a strong sense of that, but now it needs to focus outward because it's gotten too inwardly satisfied. So I think those two need to go together, and I was pleased to see that in the stories that were told.
I appreciate the dance metaphor, that these things are working in tandem with one another. Sarah, any thoughts on sort of the core elements that need to be included in a church mission or vision that might contribute toward its flourishing?
I really think tied to kind of spiritual disciplines and depth is just this idea of how do we rest in the work that Christ has already done? And how do we really have a good handle of the pace of what we're doing as churches? I think so many times we create schedules that don't leave margins for us, even as leaders. And so we're not modeling that to our congregation members. And yet, so many times, God speaks to us in that quiet voice. So many times God comes and may, quote unquote, interrupt what we're trying to do. And yet, how do we really, in the system of what we're doing in church, and how do we organize and really build in just slowness in our routines as congregations? Because I do believe God is already at work all around us. And yet, so many times we're so busy, we're not able to see God at work all around us. And so sometimes the job isn't to create the work or create the mission, but it's just to tap into what God is already doing by having a pace that allows us to have our ears and our eyes open. And so I think it's really an issue of how do we create culture of slowness as congregations, and let that be really what sets us apart from this world as well, and that enables us to tap into what God is inviting us to do day by day.
Yeah, this dovetails really nice with, I think it's in chapter 6, with the Stillwaters congregation, the concept of resonance, of the idea that churches are constantly trying to do rather than be. And a helpful invitation from our co-editor on this project, Mark Chapman, and his co-authors, James Watson and Andrea Chang, in that chapter that really help us understand that in practice in a congregational setting is really, really good to keep in mind. All right, maybe the final question we'll ask for you guys, and we'll begin with Sarah. Many churches had like classic testimony meetings, at least evangelical ones in particular, right? Where individuals within the congregation would share their testimonies, and this would be part of both the personal and collective storytelling. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about why that's maybe less common in some congregations today, and whether you think there's any merit to incorporating that again in sort of congregational storytelling, if you will.
Mm-hmm. I think there's so much merit to testimony sharing. I think in a way, there has been a bit of move away from it because there's been a move from this idea of, A church is a place where one person speaks, and that person should be very educated and should know exactly how to say what they need to say in a great way. And to be honest, as a leader, there is a vulnerability when you put somebody else with the mic up there. There's sometimes that fear of what are they going to say? How long are they going to talk? And again, that comes back to this idea that we're so highly structured in our churches these days that even our services, so many times, I remember guest preaching at a church and they had a timesheet down to the minute of when everything had to end and when everything had to begin. And we definitely need organization. The Apostle Paul will tell us we need to be organized. But then how do we also leave room for the work of the Holy Spirit to happen in ways that we don't expect? And then how do we really lean into that belief that God can really speak through every person and leave space for that? I do believe that there's a priesthood of all believers, and when we are able to hear from one another what God is doing, it really enriches just the space and the time of worship that we do have. And so even if it's not in the main service, how do we then find room where people can be sharing their stories and can be really attesting to what God has been doing in their lives, and then also take that courage to incorporate it into our larger worship and really come up with systems that help us to hold one another accountable to the stories we share so that we could hear the voice of God through each and every one of our congregation members.
Very good, very good. Father James.
Absolutely, I totally agree. It's I think that if many of our congregations are going to overcome their inertia, we have to rediscover that communities of living faith ought to be places of life transformation where our lives are changed. And whenever we experience life transformation in any way, we want to tell the story. So the very absence of a demand to tell stories, I think it points towards a lack of spiritual vitality. And I think sadly that sometimes can be used to describe many of our congregations where there simply is no longer an expectation of transformation. I've often joked that I long for the days when every single Christian church will have a warning sign hanging on the front door saying, "Warning, enter at your own risk. Your life may be transformed here." That's the kind of community that I'm sure we all believe and hope can become a reality. When that happens, stories will abound.
Wonderful, wonderful. Archbishop Linda.
Yes, you're reminding me of many years ago when I was working on a DMin around how do we maintain our unity in Christ when we find ourselves in disagreement on some issues, and how do we stay at Christ's table together? And it seemed to me that part of my thesis was that it's because we don't know each other. We don't know what has formed our values. We don't know how we've been shaped in our faith. And what I tried to do in my thesis was to bring people together. It was difficult because of the lifestyles that people live today. But we need opportunities to hear the stories of each other, to recognize the things that have formed and influenced and shaped us. And when I've taken the initiative to have people speak a testimony in church, they get far better attention than I ever did as a preacher. There would just be dead silence because people were listening to a peer talk about their faith. And I will always remember a man in his late 70s who had fallen and broken his hip, ended up in rehab hospital, and had a profound experience of God. And he got up to tell this story in the church. And the listening of the congregation to that story and his cry to God, "Why did you wait so long to show me?" Will always remain with me as a wonderful example of storytelling that influenced others, that shaped the congregation, that built community, that strengthened faith. And I just think we need to do more of it. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. A great way to conclude our time together. I just want to thank again the three of you for your graciousness, your generosity, both in authoring some material within the book, but then to spend some time with us, and hopefully a gift to church leaders across the country to think about this from a practitioner perspective. So thank you again for doing that with us today. For everyone who's joined, we're going to share this recording again later this week, so you can see that in your email, on social media as well, through our website and others. Feel free to share this with others across the country as well. We have a lot of other Canadian-based research for Canadian church leaders across the country that's on the go. If you don't currently subscribe to our website, we would invite you to check out our website at flourishingcongregations.org. And every 2 weeks, we release what we call the Flourishing Forward series, where we're providing some current Canadian-based data on Canadian churches from scholars across the country. So would invite you and those in your sphere to subscribe to that. Again, we just want to be a resource for churches across the country as best we can, and to partner with many other scholars and church leaders across the country. So on that note, we will wrap for today. Thank you again to everyone for joining today. I want to wish you a fantastic rest of the week and of the Lenten season as well, as we move closer towards Holy Week too. So thanks again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thanks, everyone.